I think there is cause for concern there, without a doubt. Officers, when they join, are subject to a vigorous vetting process. So I think probably the concern now with this recent report is more the officers that have been in for 10 years but haven't been re-vetted. And that's a procedure that probably has fallen by the wayside with some forces, perhaps down to the sheer pressure, the cutbacks, etc., etc. I was doing my homework, in actual fact, after getting the call this morning, looking at the vetting process for a lot of forces for recruits. And when you read it, it really does seem extremely thorough. And, you know, certain things have to be declared. There are interviews, references are chased up, etc., etc. I think the concern here is that perhaps officers after 10 years aren't being re-vetted. Having said that, of course, there is now concern amongst serving officers because the government are trying to recruit and get numbers back to the way they were in 2010. There are concerns, I think, that perhaps a very small minority of recruits are somehow escaping the whole recruitment process, not just vetting. And there is a risk that we might be getting some recruits perhaps who we wouldn't want because of the pressure to recruit people into the force. But I think at the moment, the main concern is around the re-vetting of 10 years. As I say, I was DV, developed vetted, when I went into Special Branch, and that really is thorough. They want to know everything about you. But it's essential, and you could argue, perhaps, that every police officer, when they join, should be vetted to the standard, that sort of standard. After 10 years, yes, more re-vetting, but every vetting process is very resource intensive, and perhaps that's where some forces have fallen down because quite simply they're struggling in terms of personnel.
Yeah, and it will be quite shocking to some people to hear that. Some people who are joining the force might actually be slipping through the net and almost avoiding the level of scrutiny that should be going into vetting police officers. I just wondered what you make of Cressida Dick's approach to this, because we've seen her come up with all sorts of solutions, sort of giving advice to women about what they should do if they don't trust a particular officer. There's talks of putting plainclothes officers outside nightclubs and things to make women feel safer. But I haven't heard her say much about how she's going to make vetting processes more robust. And I would have thought that's actually the first line of defence against officers going out and, you know, committing all sorts.
Well, that's right. And I think, in fairness, the vetting process is thorough. It'd be very interesting to see figures of people who actually fail vetting, and that's one thing we haven't seen other than Police Scotland. In my frantic homework this morning, they produced figures that show that hundreds of potential police officers have been weeded out by the vetting process. So it will be quite interesting to get figures from the Met and other forces to see how effective it's been in terms of how many officers or potential officers haven't made it because of the vetting process. So I think if the vetting process is done properly, it is fairly thorough. But then you will always get people who will fool the vetting process. I can think in my career, and I said this at a recent appearance on one of your programs, probably in my career I've met or worked with hundreds, maybe thousands of police officers. I can think of probably 30 or 40 who I didn't like very much. Perhaps there might be questions over their vetting. It could be various reasons. Perhaps, excuse me, they were prone to anger. Perhaps they were lazy. Perhaps they simply weren't very good at policing. But that's not a very great number. But then I think to myself, well, in an ideal world, they wouldn't have slipped through the vetting process. It's never going to be 100%. But yes, I think in terms of public confidence, we need to make it as thorough and robust as it possibly can be. And especially with the Met, of course, which has suffered a lot over the past few months. But let's remember, most police officers out there dealing with 2,000 emergency calls a day in London will deal with them well, will deal with them with compassion, with kindness, and how you would expect police officers to behave.
Yes, okay, absolutely. But just when you mentioned something slipping through the net there, I just wanted to ask your questions. I mean, I understand that you've worked in relation to borders for quite a bit during your career as well, and that's an issue that's raising its head today. Priti Patel, for example, highlighted what she regarded as a merry-go-round of our asylum system, highlighting the idea that apparently some people claiming asylum can game the system if they decide they want to convert to Christianity. Also highlighting the fact that there's almost like a cottage industry of lawyers, potentially, who are essentially quite keen to make money at the expense of longing out, as it were, our asylum applications. What do you make of our current asylum process? Does it need root and branch reform?
Yeah, I mean, I tended to be at the sharp end, working at airports in the UK and in Jamaica. And we did come across there in the course of our duties with immigration officers, asylum seekers. To be quite honest, when you meet a genuine asylum seeker, it hits you between the eyes. It's like a hammer blow. And I've met some that frankly have reduced me almost to tears. On the other hand, you also meet those asylum seekers and you look at them and you think, what a cheek. How dare you try and get into this country by really means that are almost laughable. The reasons they give for asylum are basically a joke. When you talk to border force officers, they will say that the whole border system across airports and seaports, right the way through to the asylum process, is a complete and utter shambles. And it has been for many years. Their morale is on the floor, they're overworked, they don't get the support. They have very little confidence, as shown by staff surveys, in Home Office officials and government ministers. So the whole system really is in chaos. And the number of asylum applications that are pending, I think, as government figures show, are thousands and thousands. So this really needed to have been sorted out years and years ago, and it's just got worse and worse. And now compounded, of course, by the people coming across in their dinghies who aren't being sent back, and probably once they're here, they're pretty safe in the knowledge that the odds of them being sent back somewhere, be it to France or to their country of origin, are pretty remote. So yeah, we've got a system in chaos, and we certainly need to, as you rightly said earlier, to bear in mind that there are people who genuinely need our help, and that help needs to be given.